Lana Rose had never been the kind of person who made a spectacle of her life. At 52, she'd seen enough of the world to appreciate quiet, structure, and the subtle value of boundaries. She wasn't reclusive or paranoid, just someone who believed that peace was something earned through consistency and strength, not a gift handed down from the world. When she moved into her brother's old home in Bridge Hollow, it wasn't because she was chasing a fresh start or running from something catastrophic. It was simply a practical decision. Her brother had accepted a long-term teaching contract overseas, and rather than leave the property vacant for 2 years, he offered Lana the keys. She accepted. There was no fanfare, no moving trucks piled to the brim, just her black SUV, a few essentials, and a modest collection of woodworking tools she'd spent decades collecting. Bridge Hollow was the kind of suburban neighborhood people imagined when they fantasized about getting out of the city. Quiet, uniform, excessively landscaped. The trees were symmetrical, the lawns carefully measured. Every mailbox looked like a clone of the one before it. Identical curvature, same bronze number plates, all perched at an exact angle toward the curb as if some unseen ruler dictated their tilt. To Lana, it was all eerily artificial, as though the place had been designed by someone who feared chaos more than boredom. Still, she didn't mind. The house was solid. Clean foundation, no roof leaks, an attached garage, and a basement sturdy enough to convert into a proper workshop. She could already imagine the thick oak slabs clamped into her bench vise, the smooth rhythm of hand tools, and the scent of linseed oil hanging in the air like incense. She spent the first week settling in without much incident. The neighbors kept their distance, which she appreciated. There were polite nods and an occasional wave, but no welcome baskets or awkward introductions. That suited her fine. That is, until Karen Brady arrived. Karen didn't knock on the door or introduce herself like a typical neighbor. Instead, Lana first encountered her during a mundane task, taking out the recycling. It was early morning, barely past 7, and Lana had just rolled the blue bin to the curb when she heard heels clicking sharply against pavement. Turning around, she saw a woman marching toward her with the stiff posture of someone who viewed a confrontation as a civic duty. She was in her late 50s, maybe older, wearing an immaculately pressed beige pantsuit, the kind that didn't bend even when the person inside it moved. Her hair was shellacked into an outdated bob, and her expression was an exercise in restrained disapproval. She didn't introduce herself at first. She pointed at Lana's mailbox. "That's crooked." Lana blinked, unsure if she'd heard her correctly. "Excuse me?" Karen folded her arms and tilted her chin as though the very sight of the offending mailbox gave her physical discomfort. "It's misaligned, not flush with the curb. See how the others are angled at 20 degrees? Yours is at least 25. It breaks the visual line of the street." It took effort for Lana not to laugh. She glanced at the mailbox. It was sturdy, upright, and fully functional. The alignment discrepancy, if it existed at all, was microscopic. She looked back at Karen. "I think it's fine where it is." Karen's lips tightened. "Well, this neighborhood has standards. We all agreed to maintain a certain aesthetic. Visual cohesion matters, especially with property values being what they are. I'd hate for you to make a poor first impression." There was no mention of her name, no smile, no effort to build rapport. Just a warning dressed up in passive aggression. Lana didn't respond. She simply nodded, turned back toward her driveway, and closed the garage door behind her. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. The next morning, the mailbox was gone. Not knocked over, not damaged, just gone. A clean hole in the ground where it had been. Lana scanned the immediate area, half expecting to find it in a trash pile or stuffed in a hedge, but it wasn't anywhere on her property. She walked down the sidewalk toward the creek that ran along the back lots of the homes. The water was low and sluggish, choked by early autumn weeds. And there, lodged between 2 rocks, was her mailbox. Half submerged and mangled, the bronze numbers scratched beyond recognition. There was no subtlety, No misunderstanding. This wasn't a random act of vandalism. This was a message. Lana stood silently on the bank for a long moment, staring at the damage. Anger didn't rise in her chest the way it might have years ago. She wasn't impulsive anymore. She didn't shout. She didn't storm down the street demanding justice. She simply took a photo of the mailbox with her phone, emailed it to her brother's property insurer, and filed a report online with the local postmaster's office. Not because she expected anyone to do anything, but because she believed in leaving a paper trail. By the end of the day, she had replaced the mailbox. Not with a flimsy aluminum unit like before. No, this one was industrial. Constructed from quarter-inch steel with welded joints and a locking faceplate, set into a 2-foot concrete foundation she poured herself. It took 4 hours, 2 bags of concrete, and enough rebar to anchor a street sign. When it dried, it looked like a hybrid between a utility box and a small safe. She even etched her last name into the side, Rose, 6 inches tall, with a cold precision that left no room for interpretation. There was no confrontation. No one came by. But Lana noticed the blinds twitch in Karen's living room window as she packed away her tools. 3 days later, the incident happened. It was dusk. Lana was reading in her workshop when she heard it. The unmistakable sound of fiberglass and plastic hitting metal, followed by the high-pitched gasp of brakes and the slap of a car door. She didn't move immediately. She let the sound play out. A second door opened, then closed. She heard muttering, something sharp, then silence. When she finally stepped outside, she saw Karen standing next to her SUV. The front bumper was dented in at the corner. The edge of Lana's new mailbox bore a small, fresh scratch, but otherwise stood unscathed. Karen's face was a twisted cocktail of indignation and disbelief, as though the mailbox had leapt out and attacked her. "You need to take that thing down," she snapped before Lana even reached the curb. "It's a hazard. It's dangerous. I backed into it at night and—" "You drove over the sidewalk?" Lana asked, voice even. "I was turning around. I have every right to adjust my position. That thing. It's within regulation height, distance from the curb, and set entirely on private property. I checked before I installed it." Karen blinked, caught off guard by the thoroughness. "I'm calling my lawyer," she spat. "You do that." And with that, Lana turned and went back inside. Not because she'd won anything. Not because the argument was over. But because she already knew what kind of person Karen was, and she knew that this was only the beginning. What Karen didn't understand, however, was that Lana was not the kind of person who cracked under pressure. She didn't escalate through emotion. She fortified through preparation. And if Karen wanted to turn this into a game, she'd soon find out that she had chosen the wrong opponent. The days following the incident with Karen's bumper passed in an eerie quiet, the kind of silence that felt more like a breath being held than an atmosphere of peace. Lana continued her routine without deviation. Early mornings spent walking the perimeter of the property with a thermos of black coffee in hand, afternoons at the workbench in her garage transforming slabs of forgotten wood into new life, and evenings. With a book, or sometimes just her own thoughts. She didn't see Karen again during that time, but she could feel the neighbor's presence like a fog behind frosted glass. There was a weight in the air that hadn't existed before, and though Lana didn't indulge in paranoia, she had enough years behind her to know when tension was quietly fermenting. It was on a Monday when the shift came. Subtle at first, a slight twist in the way things functioned. Lana received an envelope, not from a neighbor or company, but from the local community code office. Inside was a notice, formal in language, veiled in bureaucratic courtesy, and entirely absurd in its contents. It stated that her recently installed mailbox might be in violation of visual harmony expectations outlined in the neighborhood's design standards, and that an investigation had been prompted by a formal complaint concerning community safety and conformity. There was no signature, no accuser named, just a file number and a list of vague infractions about height deviation and potential visibility hazards for backing vehicles. Lana didn't need a psychic to tell her who was behind it. She read the letter twice before setting it down without a word. She didn't panic. Instead, she retrieved the packet of documents she had assembled when she first installed the mailbox. She had everything: reference diagrams, measurements, concrete cure time, photos of the install at every step, as well as a copy of the Federal Postal Guidelines. Then, just to be certain, she drove to the municipal office and spoke with a city infrastructure liaison who confirmed what she already knew. The mailbox met every code requirement. In fact, he complimented the craftsmanship. It wasn't just legal, it was exceptional. Still, as she stepped out of the building, Lana had the distinct feeling that logic was not going to be the prevailing force in this conflict. She wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding or a flawed process. She was dealing with a person who didn't want to be right. They wanted to win, and they didn't care what truth stood in their way. Karen didn't crave order. She craved control. By midweek, a new layer of agitation had begun to unfold. Lana's garbage bins, always neatly returned to the side of her garage after pickup, began appearing halfway down the street or tilted over into her hedges. It could have been the wind, maybe even careless workers, but Lana knew better. These things don't happen in threes by coincidence. The next morning, she found a thick smear of sticky liquid across the driver's side window of her SUV. It was some kind of fruit juice, or maybe melted popsicle, but it had dried into a gluey film that took her 20 minutes to scrub off. No notes, no witnesses, no direct confrontation. It was the cowardice of the act that annoyed her most. That Thursday, as she was reviewing invoices in her workshop, a sharp knock sounded at the front door. Lana walked calmly to the entrance and opened it to find a man in a blazer holding a tablet, his ID badge swinging gently from a lanyard. "Ms. Rose?" he asked. She nodded. "I'm here from the Insurance Assessment Department. We received a third-party inquiry regarding potential environmental hazards and non-compliant fixtures on your property. I've been asked to verify whether anything recently installed could pose a threat to neighborhood safety or property." Lana stared at him for a moment, then narrowed her eyes slightly. "A third-party inquiry. Anonymous, I presume." The man gave her a measured smile. "I'm not at liberty to say, but if you'd be willing to allow me a quick walkthrough—" "No," she said without raising her voice. "You may return when you have a court-issued order or official complaint signed by someone willing to put their name on paper. Until then, I'm not required to open my property to speculative evaluations based on someone's vendetta." The man didn't argue. He wasn't hostile, just mildly disappointed in that bureaucratic way people get when someone ruins their checklist. He thanked her, walked back to his car, and drove off. That evening, Lana walked the perimeter again, slowly and deliberately. The mailbox stood unbothered, like a silent witness in a trial with no jury. It was more than just a piece of steel now. It had become the line she had drawn in the sand, the immovable object that refused to bend to anyone else's discomfort. She admired it in the same way a veteran might regard a worn scar, not as something to flaunt, but as something that marked the moment where she stopped being accommodating. Late that night, well past 11, Lana heard something. Not loud, but deliberate. The sound of gravel under tires, then the sharp crunch of a quick turn followed by a short, sudden stop. She didn't move immediately. Instead, she turned off the interior lights, stepped quietly to the window, and pulled the curtain just enough to see. A familiar SUV was parked across the street, engine running, headlights off. After a minute, it drove away. No one got out. In the morning, she found that her lawn sprinkler had been snapped in two. It wasn't an old part. She'd just replaced the housing a week ago. No footprints, no tire marks on the grass. Whoever had done it had been careful, methodical. Lana didn't fix it right away. She photographed it, added it to a growing folder she'd started keeping on a thumb drive. Bridge Hollow. Incidents. Each item had a timestamp, a description, a theory. She wasn't collecting evidence to win some grand courtroom drama. She was documenting a pattern, because if this continued, she would need to prove the context. People like Karen knew how to operate just below the threshold of legal consequence, dancing along that thin line where harassment was hard to name and harder to prosecute. But patterns spoke, and Lana had learned a long time ago that persistence left a fingerprint. The final straw that week came in the form of a notice taped to her garage door. It was printed on a sheet of plain white paper, not official in appearance but worded with venomous civility. It stated that several concerned residents had taken issue with her aggressive installation, and that her refusal to conform with established aesthetic expectations had created tension in the community. It concluded with a suggestion that perhaps she would find a more suitable environment in a less regulated area. It wasn't just condescending. It was a thinly veiled demand that she leave. She took the paper inside, flattened it out on the table, and read it 3 more times. Then she poured herself a glass of water, opened her laptop, and began writing emails. One to her lawyer, outlining the last 2 weeks in measured detail. Another to the local code office, requesting written clarification on their prior mailbox inquiry. And a third to a professional mediator she had used once in a contract negotiation years ago. She didn't plan to escalate anything herself, not yet. But she wanted her team in place. Karen, in her relentless pursuit of dominance, had made a critical mistake. She assumed Lana was a pushover. She assumed that Lana's refusal to fight meant fear. But Lana wasn't afraid. She just believed in timing. And now, as she looked over the documents she had gathered, she knew hers was coming soon. Lana had always believed that escalation wasn't something that happened by accident. It was built, layer by careful layer, with the same deliberateness as a piece of crafted furniture. Measured, assembled, reinforced until it stood on its own and demanded attention. That's exactly what the situation with Karen was becoming. What had started as a neighborhood nuisance had turned into something else entirely. Not a war in the literal sense, but a deliberate pattern of pressure and provocation designed to push her toward surrender or retaliation, neither of which she intended to grant. The following week began deceptively calm. The mailbox stood firm, the garage door stayed unmarked, and the mornings were quiet enough that birdsong reached her windows uninterrupted. It was the kind of peace that didn't feel like peace at all. Too symmetrical, too precise, like a silence meant to distract you from the snare being set. Lana didn't relax into it. She merely noted the pause, marked it mentally as a tactical lull, and continued documenting everything with the calm efficiency of someone laying groundwork, not reacting in panic. Her lawyer, a methodical and thorough woman named Cassandra Breen, had replied within hours of Lana's last message. She advised restraint, but also encouraged Lana to continue her records and reminded her that the burden of proof in civil harassment cases rested largely on consistency. People like this rely on you acting out emotionally, Cassandra had said in their brief call. You're doing the opposite. Keep it that way. It was good advice, and Lana intended to follow it to the letter. On Thursday morning, she walked out to retrieve her mail and stopped short halfway down the path. Her feet found the trail of shattered glass before her eyes did. It was a clear, deliberate scatter across her walkway, concentrated near the base of her steps, as though a bottle had been hurled from the street. The fragments were green, glinting in the sun, and too spread out to be accidental. There were no recycling bins in sight, no wind strong enough to have carried something so specific from another yard. Lana took photos from multiple angles before sweeping it up with gloves and depositing the remains into a labeled evidence bag she'd purchased online for this exact reason. That afternoon, her neighbor across the street, a retired man named Gerald who had thus far kept his head low during the tension, approached her while she was watering the hedge along the fence. He didn't come too close, just stood at the edge of the sidewalk with an uncomfortable expression and hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. "I just want to say," he began without preamble, "I saw someone near your yard last night, around 1:30. Black hoodie. Looked like they tossed something toward your house and walked off. Didn't get a good look. I was half asleep." Lana nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me." He looked relieved. Didn't want to get in the middle. "But that mailbox business? It's gone too far." He walked away before she could say anything else. She didn't blame him. That was the environment Karen had built around herself, one where silence felt safer than honesty. But Gerald had finally broken it, and that mattered. The next incident came in broad daylight, and it was unmistakably direct. Lana had gone out to pick up a delivery, a package containing specialty brass hinges she'd ordered for a commissioned cabinet, and found the box at the base of her steps. Torn open. The contents inside were missing, replaced with a crumpled note written in thick black marker that read, "No one cares about your projects." It wasn't just invasive, it was personal. Lana felt the first twinge of something hotter than anger settle in her chest. Something colder, sharper, not fear, precision. This was no longer about territory. It was about identity. Someone had crossed a line they didn't fully understand. She filed a police report immediately, not expecting miracles but knowing it mattered in the long-term paper trail. She forwarded everything to Cassandra, who agreed they were now accumulating enough for a civil claim of targeted harassment. "If this continues," her lawyer wrote, "we'll file an injunction. Let them explain this to a judge." But Karen wasn't finished. 2 days later, Lana returned from the hardware store to find 3 cars parked in front of her home, Karen's SUV among them, along with 2 other vehicles she didn't recognize. On her lawn stood 4 individuals, including Karen, all of them with clipboards and laminated badges clipped to their collars. Lana parked calmly, stepped out, and approached with even steps. Karen turned toward her with a bright, performative smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Lana, we were just conducting a neighborhood standards audit. I'm sure you don't mind." Lana's gaze flicked over the others. Their badges were real, but local, property appearance compliance officers, the kind dispatched on request when enough residents filed petitions. Karen had no real authority to lead them, but she'd clearly orchestrated this with the flair of someone hosting a stage play. "I mind," Lana said flatly, "and unless you have an appointment or notice of inspection signed by the city, you're trespassing." One of the inspectors cleared his throat. "We've had some community concerns filed anonymously. We're obligated to check any claim that might impact neighborhood safety or uniformity." Karen smiled wider. "And of course, I've been helping facilitate the conversation." Lana didn't respond to Karen. Instead, she turned directly to the city representative. "You can walk the sidewalk. You do not have my permission to step onto the lawn. This is private property." There was an uncomfortable pause. The lead inspector nodded, respectful but wary. "Understood." They walked the edge of the property, pointed at shrubs, took notes, made non-committal observations about hedge height and mailbox distance, none of which violated any ordinance. Karen lingered, offering commentary that Lana tuned out entirely. When they left, Lana went inside and made 2 phone calls, one to Cassandra and the other to the city clerk's office to request the names of all individuals who had initiated neighborhood complaints against her in the last 30 days. The clerk hesitated, but Lana knew the public record laws well enough to press. Within 48 hours, she had the list. There was only one name on it: Karen Brady. It was confirmation, but not surprise. Lana stared at the printed record for several long minutes, then filed it away without ceremony. Her hand hovered over her keyboard, debating whether to start the injunction process now. But she held off. Not out of hesitation, but because her strategy had always been endurance. Let Karen make another mistake, one more documented misstep, and she'd have a complete picture to present to the judge. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees and shadows stretched across the street, Lana stood beside her reinforced mailbox and ran her fingers over the steel etching of her name. She could see Karen watching from behind her blinds, a silhouette wrapped in drapery and pride. Lana didn't wave. She didn't blink. She simply turned, walked back up her steps, and closed the door with the calm of someone who knew exactly how much stronger she was than the woman trying to provoke her. And this time, there would be no more warnings. The silence after the inspection wasn't relief, it was recoil. Lana had lived long enough to understand that people like Karen didn't retreat because they were tired or ashamed. They pulled back only to prepare something louder, more dramatic, something they believed would finally tilt the balance in their favor. Lana, meanwhile, didn't stop moving. She tightened her documentation, scanned every paper, organized her incident logs by date and category, and kept her lawyer informed of every new detail. Cassandra responded with increasing sharpness in her tone. What started as caution had shifted into the confident rhythm of someone building a pre-litigation framework. "If she goes further," she said in one of their scheduled calls, "we'll file. You've done everything right. Let her bury herself." And Karen was, indeed, digging. One morning, Lana opened her mailbox to find a plain envelope, no return address, sealed with a strip of packing tape. She knew better than to assume it was harmless, so she opened it carefully, gloved at her workbench. Inside were printed screenshots of social media posts, her personal accounts, dating back years, highlighted, circled, annotated in red pen. Comments she'd made on forums about building codes and craftsmanship. A post about a dispute she once had with a contractor. Even a sarcastic meme about neighborhood rules being the new tyranny. Beneath it all was a single line written in large, uneven handwriting. "So much for being a good neighbor." It wasn't a threat, not exactly, but it was an intrusion, and more than that, it was obsessive. Karen had gone from confrontation to surveillance. Lena stared at the packet for a long time, her stomach turning not with fear, but with cold disgust. There was something deeply unwell in the way this woman operated, weaponizing petty grievances, collecting fragments of someone's life to build a false narrative of threat and instability. Lana wasn't afraid of Karen, but she understood something clearly now. This wasn't just personal, it was pathological. She submitted the envelope to Cassandra and forwarded photos to the local sheriff's liaison, who quietly opened a file and advised her to install more exterior lighting. That same day, Lana invested in 2 motion-triggered floodlights, one for the driveway and one for the side yard. She didn't want cameras. She didn't want to live in a surveillance compound. But she wasn't about to ignore tactical defense. She knew how to protect space, how to prepare. The true midpoint arrived not with a bang, but a letter. Delivered by certified mail, the envelope bore the seal of the Municipal Adjustment Board and informed Lana that a formal request had been filed to reevaluate the visual and structural impact of her mailbox, this time under the zoning clause, relating to community visual obstructions and driver visibility studies. The filing was detailed with diagrams. Karen had hired a private consultant to produce a mock study suggesting that Lana's mailbox created a blind spot dangerous for backing vehicles. There were photos taken from odd angles, exaggerated illustrations of vehicle trajectories, and even a manipulated image that made the mailbox look twice its size. Lana sat with the file spread across her dining table, absorbing it in absolute silence. It was theatrical. It was desperate. But more importantly, it was expensive. Karen had spent real money on this, which meant she believed in the strategy. She believed Lana would fold under the bureaucratic weight, the procedural drag, the legal fees. Instead, Lana wrote a response. With Cassandra's help, she compiled a counter-document, measurements confirmed by a licensed engineer, a notarized letter from the city inspector who had reviewed the installation, and a copy of the original postal regulations that confirmed her. Placement was well within compliance. They submitted it with cool efficiency, filing it 3 days before the hearing deadline. But Lana didn't stop there. She remembered something Gerald had told her in passing, that Karen had once driven another neighbor out of the area through similar tactics, accusing them of noise pollution, due to a humming refrigerator they kept in their garage. Curious, Lana made a quiet trip to the county records office and requested access to public zoning disputes for her block. The clerk, an older man with little interest in suburban politics, handed her a small folder. Inside were 5 previous disputes, all involving Karen Brady as the complainant. In every case, the complaints followed a similar arc: minor infraction, obsessive escalation, character defamation, and then silence when the target moved out or relented. Lana didn't feel vindicated. She felt nauseated. This woman wasn't just territorial. She was a serial harasser operating under the guise of civic concern. But now, Lana had something Karen hadn't anticipated: pattern, precedent, and legal alignment. Cassandra, upon reviewing the files, said only, "We're filing the harassment claim." By the end of the week, the paperwork was submitted. A judge would review it within 30 days. Lana sat on her porch that night, the new floodlights casting sharp angles across the walkway. The mailbox stood silently like a sentinel, defiant, heavy, unbreakable. She didn't feel triumphant. Not yet, but she felt anchored. She wasn't going anywhere. The filing of the harassment claim did not bring silence. It brought escalation. Lana had anticipated a reaction, though perhaps not the breadth of it, not the sheer speed with which Karen seemed to adapt her tactics and widen the battlefield. For the first time since the conflict began, Lana sensed that Karen was beginning to unravel, not in the way of someone giving up, but in the more dangerous way of someone who realized that the traditional power dynamics were no longer working. Karen's behavior no longer felt like a campaign of boundary enforcement. It had started to resemble siege warfare, where no tool was too petty, no gesture too low. And Lana, fortified as she was by preparation and process, still felt the weight of the coming confrontation pressing closer by the day. It began with the garbage. Again. One morning, after a particularly heavy rainstorm, Lana awoke to find her trash bins tipped, not simply over, but overturned into her own flower beds. The lids were gone, contents half soaked and wedged beneath the boxwoods she'd just replanted 2 weeks prior. It wasn't accidental. Someone had dragged them, positioned them deliberately, and then vanished without a trace. She photographed everything before even touching a broom, logged the time, and forwarded the report to Cassandra. By that afternoon, one of her small solar-powered lights lining the walkway had also vanished. That evening, her doorbell rang at 10:43 p.m. But when she opened the door, no one stood there. It happened again the next night, 10:42 p.m. This time, she was ready. She opened the door swiftly, phone in hand, video recording. No one. Again. Not a soul on the street. But a faint, hollow knock echoed 2 houses down a moment later, like a chain reaction. It wasn't kids. It was coordinated, too precise, too controlled. Karen wasn't just working alone anymore. She was involving others, or at the very least, weaponizing the silence and complicity of their shared neighborhood. The realization didn't frighten Lana, but it forced her to accept something she had previously avoided admitting. This was no longer a contained dispute. This was a campaign. Then came the permit complaint. Lana received a formal notice informing her that a complaint had been filed regarding unpermitted renovations. Someone had submitted photos to the city that showed her workshop's interior, including her professional-grade lighting setup and the venting system she had recently installed to improve airflow. There was nothing illegal about what she had done. She was working entirely within zoning and utility regulations, But the photos weren't taken from the street. They were taken from an elevated angle, suggesting either a ladder had been used or that someone had stood on a vehicle or adjacent property line to get the vantage point. It wasn't just a violation of privacy, it was a strategic invasion, meant to provoke fear and doubt. She responded through her lawyer with every permit, schematic, and code certification she had acquired. The complaint was dropped after a week, but the damage wasn't legal. It was psychological. The message was clear. Karen would reach into any corner, inspect any detail, to discredit her. Lana began to notice more subtle shifts. Neighbors who once waved now glanced away, or worse, gave her tight, neutral nods that smelled of discomfort and fear. Karen, it seemed, had begun cultivating a shadow narrative, painting Lana not as a target of harassment, but as the difficult one, the outlier, the combative newcomer who disrupted their serene, rule-abiding block. Lana didn't have to guess what was being said. She could feel it in the way people began to behave like hostages in their own yards, careful not to be seen talking to her too long, or at all. The turning point came with the incident involving the contractor. Lana had scheduled an HVAC technician to do routine maintenance on the system her brother had installed before moving. The appointment was on a Friday morning, and she greeted the man, a 30-something named David, at the door with coffee and the usual pre-service paperwork. He was pleasant, efficient, and immediately got to work. Within 15 minutes, Lana stepped outside to check her mail and noticed Karen standing across the street with her arms folded, phone to her ear. Lana ignored her and went back inside. An hour later, 2 uniformed officers knocked at her door. "Ma'am," one began, polite but firm, "we received a report of unlicensed labor on private property, possibly involving a code violation regarding home heating systems." Lana's face remained unreadable. She gestured toward the technician, who now stood confused beside the HVAC unit, holding his inspection clipboard. "He's certified," Lana said, then turned toward David. "Show them your license, please." He did. The officer read it, made a few notes, then looked slightly annoyed. "We've had 4 calls from this street in the past month. Same kind of complaints, always unfounded." Lana arched an eyebrow. "All from the same source." The officer hesitated, then gave a faint nod. "If it happens again, feel free to file a harassment claim of your own. We're starting to build a picture here." They left without further comment, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Lana knew what it meant. Even law enforcement, slow-moving and reluctant as it often was in neighborhood disputes, had begun to see a pattern. Karen's methods were no longer clever. They were transparent, excessive, brittle. Still, the fallout wasn't limited to tension. The next week, a petition circulated on the block, thinly veiled as a community character and safety survey, but laced with obvious targeting. Among the questions: do you feel safe with workshops running late into the evening in residential zones? And would you support aesthetic revisions to properties that deviate from established visual norms? Lana managed to obtain a copy through Gerald, who handed it to her with an apologetic shrug. "I didn't sign," he said, "but they're going door to door." "They?" Lana asked. "Karen and one of the Walker's boys, the younger one. I guess he's helping her with errands." So it was confirmed. Karen had recruited help, directly or by persuasion. That alone shifted the balance of things. It was no longer just her paranoia pressing against Lana's calm. It was an organized strategy, amateurish though it was, designed to paint Lana into a corner of isolation. Lana didn't respond with drama. She responded with paperwork. She filed a counter-petition, formally written, legally sound, titled Petition for Enforcement of Personal Property Rights and Community Harassment Review. She attached copies of every complaint, citation, false report, and city dismissal. Gerald and 3 others signed within the first 2 days. By the 5th, she had 12 names. Quiet ones. neighbors who had never spoken much, but who had watched. People who weren't ready to confront Karen directly, but were more than ready to stop being pawns in her game. Karen, sensing the shift, doubled down. On a cold Tuesday morning, Lana awoke to find the side of her workshop tagged in chalk. Not spray paint, not permanent, but a message nonetheless. A crude drawing of a house with X's through the windows and the word "Get Out" scrawled below it. It wasn't a child's prank. The lines were sharp, angled, and intentional. Someone had planned this. She took photos, then washed it away without ceremony. The same day, Cassandra called with an update. The judge had accepted their harassment case into review. A hearing would be scheduled in the next month. Lana stood at the center of her property that evening, the sky bruised with low clouds, and looked out at the edges of her lawn, the steel mailbox still untouched and firm. The war hadn't ended, but the terrain was no longer shifting under her feet. She had carved out her position, fortified her boundaries, not just legally, but mentally, emotionally, physically. Karen could plot and whisper and sabotage, but it no longer felt like she was winning. It felt like she was scrambling, like a woman trying to preserve a throne everyone else had quietly stopped kneeling before. And Lana? Lana was still standing, still silent, still certain, and she wasn't going anywhere. The summons came on a rainy Thursday, hand-delivered by a neutral courier with a tired expression and a clipboard bearing Lana's name in large, bold letters. She accepted it without ceremony, signed the receipt, and closed the door as the first crack of thunder rolled across the distance. The envelope was thick, unnecessarily formal, and embossed with the official seal of the County Mediation and Dispute Resolution Court. The date of the hearing was set for 3 weeks from that day. Attached were statements from both parties. Lana recognized her own language carefully prepared by Cassandra and filed weeks ago. But the other document was what caught her attention. Karen had submitted a countersuit: defamation, emotional distress, and community disruption. It was a transparent attempt to deflect, to reframe the story in her favor, to confuse the record just enough to force delays or settlement. But Lana didn't flinch. She read every word, annotated every lie, and sent the entire package to her attorney, who responded with 2 simple words: "We're ready." The final days before the hearing unfolded with the mechanical precision of ritual. Lana awoke early, kept her routines tight, her documentation tighter. She knew what she was walking into. Not a courtroom in the cinematic sense, but a conference room with folding chairs, dull fluorescent lighting, and a retired mediator trained to resolve neighborly squabbles with the tone of a patient grandfather. But this was not a squabble. This was war in a minor key. And Lana wasn't attending to negotiate. She was attending to finish it. On the day itself, she arrived 10 minutes early, Cassandra beside her in a slate-colored suit and holding a black folio that contained their entire case in chronological detail. Karen was already there, seated at the other end of the room, flanked by an attorney who looked flustered before the process even began. Karen herself wore the expression of someone playing victim by muscle memory. A quiet, restrained look, chin slightly tilted, lips pursed like a woman bracing for a wound she'd rehearsed in the mirror. The mediator welcomed them with a tired smile, offered coffee no one took, and read the summaries aloud for the record. And then it began. Karen's attorney spoke first. She outlined the emotional toll the conflict had allegedly taken on her client: sleepless nights, anxiety, fear for her safety. She cited unprovoked hostility, escalating aggression, and willful disruption of community norms. She presented the photos Karen had doctored, oversized renderings of the mailbox, distorted timelines, and anecdotes written in vague, emotional language. The mediator nodded politely, scribbled notes, and asked a few clarifying questions which the attorney answered with mechanical precision. Karen remained quiet, eyes cast downward, fingers folded on her lap like a churchgoer awaiting forgiveness. Then it was Cassandra's turn. Her tone was even, confident, and cold. She presented the real photos, the real timelines, the full list of every complaint Karen had ever filed in the neighborhood over the last 5 years, 5 of which had ended in documented relocations. She showed video stills, sworn statements from neighbors, and the official police documentation from each false report. Lana watched as the mediator's eyes began to shift, not in favor, but in realization. A pattern was emerging. A deliberate, repetitive strategy of harassment masquerading as civic duty. But it was the packet of envelopes that changed everything. Cassandra reached into the folio and produced the envelope Lana had received, the one with the printed screenshots annotated in red marker, delivered anonymously. Inside was a forensic analysis confirming the printer model, which matched one registered to Karen's home office from a previous business license. The marker handwriting had been compared to a signature Karen had submitted on a prior permit application, enough of a match to cast serious suspicion. Not proof for a criminal court, but enough to destroy any illusion of innocence in this setting. Karen's attorney faltered. He asked for a recess. The mediator declined. He asked for the countersuit to be separated. Again, declined. Then, for the first time, Karen spoke. "This woman moved in and disrupted everything," she said, voice brittle, barely restrained. "She doesn't respect the rhythm of the neighborhood. She's confrontational. She built that thing to provoke me. To make a point." "That thing," Lana said quietly, her voice cutting through the room like steel, "is a mailbox. It's built to receive mail. You're the one who made it a symbol." The room fell still. The mediator closed his notebook. "I have heard enough." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice had the finality of a gavel. Within 10 minutes the decision was rendered. Lana's claim was validated in full. Karen's countersuit was dismissed with prejudice. The mediator recommended that Karen cease all further communication, direct or indirect, with Lana, and warned that any violation would constitute grounds for restraining order escalation. A formal letter would be sent within the week, including a summary for the neighborhood committee and law enforcement reference. It wasn't just a win, it was a reckoning. Outside the building, the air smelled of stormwater and cut grass. Cassandra shook Lana's hand firmly, smiled for the first time in weeks, and promised to follow up on the restraining logistics. Lana thanked her, not just for the legal skill, but for never underestimating the weight of what this had been. She drove home in silence, passing the familiar turns of her neighborhood with a quiet certainty in her spine. When she reached her driveway, she sat for a moment, engine off, watching Karen's house across the street. The blinds didn't move. No car in the driveway. The SUV was gone, and then, as the sun broke through the clouds in thin golden strips, Lana stepped out, walked to her mailbox, and placed her palm against the cool steel. It was unmarked, undamaged, and unmoving. The name, etched into its side, still gleamed. She turned, walked into her home, and locked the door behind her. Not out of fear, but out of habit. The war was over. She had not just survived. She had endured. In the weeks that followed the hearing, the atmosphere around Lana's home began to shift in small but tangible ways, like the slow receding of floodwater after a storm. Not with grand gestures or sudden apologies, but with the quiet realignments of a neighborhood no longer sure where its alliances truly stood. No one spoke of the decision aloud, but people knew. Word had traveled faster than paper, faster than any official summary ever could. Karen had not just lost the case, she had lost the narrative. And in a community like Bridge Hollow, where appearance was currency and silence was a form of agreement, the erosion of reputation often hurt more than the legal blow itself. Lana didn't gloat. She didn't throw a party, post a notice, or revel in her vindication. Instead, she resumed her work, returned to her patterns, and let the stability she had fought to reclaim speak for itself. The mailbox remained untouched, and its very presence began to feel less like a boundary marker and more like a monument. Silent, dense and immovable. It no longer needed to prove anything. Its message had been received. The neighbors began to re-emerge slowly, cautiously. Gerald resumed his morning walks, sometimes nodding with more familiarity than before. The woman, 2 houses down, who had once signed Karen's petition, brought over a small jar of preserves with no note, no explanation, just a gesture. Even the couple with the trimmed hedges and the pristine SUV who had avoided eye contact for months began waving again, subtle, tentative, but real. No one spoke about Karen. They didn't need to. She had become the story everyone wanted to forget but wouldn't soon unlearn. As for Karen herself, she retreated. Her SUV disappeared from the street for long stretches, and when it did return it was parked at odd angles, as if she were avoiding looking at Lana's property altogether. The blinds in her front window remained closed during the day, and she no longer lingered on her porch with a clipboard or called out to passers-by. The campaign had collapsed, and with it the illusion of her control over the neighborhood. She was still there, still occupying space, but no longer defining it. Lana, in turn, began to reclaim hers, not through confrontation, but through quiet cultivation. She repaired the damage to her flower beds, replaced the solar lights with stronger fixtures, and built a small wooden bench near the mailbox where neighbors could rest during walks. She added a little free library on a post beside it, stocked with classic novels, woodworking guides, and a few books on boundary law. It was a subtle kind of humor, the kind she appreciated. Layered, dry, not spiteful, but unignorable. Children began to sit on the bench. Retired couples left dog biscuits and paperback novels. Someone dropped off a potted plant without a name. It all meant something. Not allegiance, not hero worship, but acknowledgement. Respect, not for victory, but for resilience. For the first time since moving in, Lana felt the land beneath her was no longer shifting. She could breathe without bracing. She could work late into the night without wondering what waited on the other side of the garage door. She could exist, wholly and unapologetically, without narrating her right to do so. One morning, as the sun rose in gold slats through the trees, Lana stood beside the mailbox with a cup of strong coffee and watched a new couple pull into the house 2 doors down. Movers unloaded boxes. A woman waved. Lana waved back. A new beginning for someone else, in a place she had once considered hostile territory. She felt no fear for them, no warning on her tongue. Let the past belong to those who needed it. Lana had carved out something better. And as the wind swept softly through the leaves and